Yeah, it's recording now. We're good. So how do you want to do it, though, Eli? Okay. Welcome, guys, to episode 14 of EDHTakes. If that joke went over your head, that was the EDHREC cast song that they do on their podcast. And why, Eli, why is it that we were doing that at the beginning?
We're going to talk about EDHREC today. So, Spencer, along the lines of the EDHREC cast, say a funny joke now.
I wasn't ready.
Make me laugh, funny man.
Monkey, white cards.
We have fun.
We like to have fun around here. But yeah, like we were saying, I'm Spencer Cook.
And I'm Elijah Samuelson.
And we're back for episode 14, like we said before. And like I said as well, like you said, Eli, we're going to be talking about EDHREC. This is an episode that we've been kind of wanting to do for a while now. But it's kind of intimidating, I'd say, right, Eli? Like we've had it on the back burner, but we hadn't.
Yeah, it's a little bit confrontational. This might be one. We've done stuff before that people probably wouldn't like, and we've probably said things that people wouldn't like. But this one is one where I think people might feel more strongly, and it might come across like we're attacking individuals or the website, but that's really not the purpose of this. We just want to clear some things, you know?
Yeah, and this is specifically, the episode is about the website EDHREC.com, not the podcast that the EDHREC cast does about Commander.
Yeah, not specifically those guys.
Might mention some of their things at some point just because they're relevant, but...
Yeah, we're just here to air some grievances.
Yeah. So you want to maybe get us into the start of this then, Eli?
Yeah, to intro this, pretty much there's little in the way of collectible data for Commander. Like, there's no top 8s, there's no GPs, there's no way to really gauge... Like, we mentioned this on the ban list episode a little bit, how you can't really gauge the strongest decks in the format that well. Commander's far from solved. There's just very little data out there, but in this barren wasteland of little to no data, there's one gleaming pillar of truth, some might think.
Yeah, you think so?
And everyone looks towards it, and people want to know things. They don't want to feel like they're in the dark, so they look at this. They look at the great EDHREC as it is, the bastion of hope.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to kind of talk about that, like, EDHREC is probably the most popular Commander website on the internet, I believe. I mean, I don't have data for that, but I don't think many people would contest that idea, right? Like, it's very popular, everybody recommends it, and there's good reasons to recommend it, but yeah, it's no doubt synonymous with Commander itself, right?
Well, and while there's certainly other popular websites for Magic in general, there's no specifically Commander-oriented website that I would think is more popular than EDHREC.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things that, EDHREC does is they collect data from some websites, and they use that to provide recommendations on commanders and cards for commander decks, and they show things like popularity. We'll probably go over a lot of these things later on, but, there's just a lot of stuff that they do. And some of it's okay, some of it's a little bit iffy, in my opinion. Mm. And we kind of want to talk about mostly how EDHREC data is often misinterpreted, and a lot of people kind of think that it's more meaningful than I think you and I really think it is, Eli, right?
Yeah, EDHREC can be a very useful tool, and it is a net positive thing that it exists, but like I said there, it's a tool, and how people use it is sometimes incorrectly.
Yeah, so, just not to claim some sort of academic background, like Eli and I are not statisticians. I have a couple classes I have took in college about statistics and probabilities, but that's nothing near what is necessary to do statistics stuff. I would say I know enough to know that I don't know, if you're familiar with that phrase. But so my point here is that stats is hard, especially for conglomerating data like for Commander. And because stats is so difficult, we should really evaluate how the EDHREC data is used and kind of not assume too much from it.
Mm-hmm.
So Do you want to kind of get into our first point about EDHREC, Eli?
Yeah, we broke this down into 3 major points against EDHREC. Like, not specifically that the website is doing anything wrong, but points where maybe people are misunderstanding some things.
Yeah, or things that, people should keep in mind when they're to figure out how much they should value the data, how much they should weigh the data, right?
Yeah. So point number 1, incomplete data. So we wanted to mention which sources EDHREC draws their data from and which ones they notably left out.
Yeah. It's one of the things, for statistics is making sure you have a good sample size and as well as a good a cross-sectional sample size, a sample size that isn't biased in some ways. And it's hard to make an affirmative or a negative on that without going too hard about it. But one thing we want to bring up is EDHREC excludes one of the largest deck building websites, tappedout.net. And it's not by choice. Tappedout.net used to be, you used to let them scrape data from their website, but I think they had some API changes and the EDHREC is no longer allowed to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so notably, they still collect from EtherHub, Archidect, Commander Spellbook, Deck Stats, Moxfield, MTG Goldfish, and Scryfall.
Yep, no other websites other than those 7 or 8 that you just listed there.
Which, before doing this, I'm aware of Scryfall. I don't use it that much, but I didn't even know that people put decks on Scryfall.
Yeah, there are some decks on Scryfall, although I don't think it is nearly one of the most popular deck building websites, but I do think Scryfall is one of the best websites for Magic in general, but that's just my opinion on that. But
and I'm sure aside from Tapped Out, there probably are like smaller websites that they don't draw from, but we're not aware of them. So
yeah, they're not as relevant.
We can't speak to that.
Tapped Out is really the big omission there, and it's really unfortunate because excluding Tapped Out itself doesn't necessarily make the data wrong or bad. It is very unfortunate that what at least at one point was the most popular website is now excluded. There's arguments for whether or not that is the most popular anymore. I'm not entirely sure about that. I would probably edge on the side of it still being the most popular, but that it's kind of digressing from the point. It's just kind of unfortunate that it's excluded, and you have to at least take that as a point against the validity of the data. Mm-hmm. And some interesting things about that as well is some popular like YouTube and Twitch streams and stuff like that still use Tapped Out for a lot of their things. Like, for example, arguably the largest Commander YouTube channel, Game Nights, Command Zone, all of their deck lists for all of their Game Nights episodes are always on Tapped Out. They have been since the start.
Yeah, in their show notes, they link to the deck lists, and that has been tapped out. Yeah, and it continues to be tapped out.
Even now.
Even after, they've recently, within the last year or two, Command Zone has been handling the post-production work for EDHREC and like helping with their editing and other behind-the-scenes stuff for the podcast. Yeah. And I just think you would think that they would move their deck lists onto other websites as well as Tapped Out. I mean, I'm not sure if they do. I don't believe they do.
They're all this in their description. That's all I can go off of, and they're all links to Tapped Out. So
that's just something to keep in mind.
Additionally, at least historically, I know it's not necessarily what we're talking about, but for CEDH, a lot of the classic like CEDH primers, like that people would write, a primer being like a deck list as well as like a very detailed description, as well as like, instructions on how to play it, card choices, stuff like that. That's what a primer is if you're not aware. Most of those primers are on Tapped Out because that was like the place where people would make their decks for a long time, and they've kind of been grandfathered in as like the place for a lot of CEDH deck lists even now. And something else that's kind of funny is that it's just kind of a funny anecdote here. There is a tier list for Pauper competitive EDH, and the Pauper competitive EDH tier list website is on Deck Stats, and it links to sample deck lists for decks, and some of those sample deck lists are either on Moxfield, which EDHREC does pull from, and some of them are on Tapped Out. And the only reason why a deck list is on Tapped Out or on Moxfield is just who ended up putting it on the site. So my point is, there's not really a standard. It's really like even in like places where you'd expect everything to be the same, some things are represented, sometimes they're not. They're in different places. There's no standard.
Yeah, there's no consensus on what is the best or the most ubiquitous deck building website out there.
Mm-hmm.
Notably, though, another thing from Tapped Out, that's where the EDHTakes deck lists are.
If you ever want to look for EDH,
so if you want to see our decks and be like, these decks suck ass, what are these guys talking about? Mm-hmm. You can go on there. I think I had a tweet linking my deck list at one point. We could maybe put that out again or put it in the show notes or something.
I've got a link to one of my lists on there. You can go for my profile and find it on our Twitter.
Yeah, and
scroll back.
Decks are probably a little out of date. There's been a lot of new sets recently, and I kind of make one or two changes, usually like per set, and probably haven't caught up quite yet. But
we don't tweet all that much. You can probably find our lists pretty easily.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. A lot of Magic players tweet a lot, many times a day. It's hard to scroll back and find their stuff.
I don't have that many thoughts in my head. Like,
yeah, or just maybe it's a
you gotta save it for the podcast.
Save it for the podcast. Well, I think
Was there anything else you wanted to say about the
their sources, right? Like the exclusions.
Yeah, the incomplete data. Anything else we think about that, Spencer?
Yeah, I think it's just it's just a thing that's swept under the rug a lot, I think, and I just want to emphasize that Tapped Out really, it may be like our only point on this section, but Tapped Out is an important part of the online like deck lists. And I mean, that kind of transitions me into our next point a little bit, which is about misleading data. Sometimes there's some, and it's not like they're misleading the data. It's more like that users will misinterpret the data. But like the main problem with EDHREC is not the data that it collects. It's how the data is interpreted by players and by content creators as well. So why don't we just kind of get into that a little bit, Eli, and you can tell me some of the problems with the way that the data is interpreted.
Yeah, so there is a lot of information on EDHREC, and if you'll see a card or a commander, and it'll say, for cards at least, it'll say this is in a certain percentage of decks. It'll say this is in like 21% of, and then it'll have a number.
Mm-hmm.
And that number is supposed to represent the amount of possible decks that card could go into. So if it's like a Dovin's Veto, that could go into any deck with both white and blue in it.
And decks that contain more colors, white, blue, and green or whatever, right? Yeah.
So any deck with at least those colors, it should have, that number should be representative of the white, blue, plus decks.
Yeah, and sometimes they also give you exact numbers, like it says 10% out of 60,000 decks or something like that, right?
Yeah, and so there's these numbers, like if something says this card is in 10% of blank, you might look at that and be like, oh, it's saying 10% of like all decks on the website.
Yeah, and that's not a problem with their data. It's just that sometimes it's not very clear what it means. I don't think there's really many places where it tells you what this means. It'll just say % of decks.
Yeah, and we were doing some research for this, and we even went through and looked at, I was looking through some Boros stuff and saw Esper Sentinel, and it said this was in like 20% of a much lower, like the average number for white decks was like 200,000 or something like that. And it was saying this is in like 20% of like 6,000 decks, and I'm like, wait, what's that number come from? And there's these different numbers that come up for different cards, and could we figure out exactly what that, we had some guesses as to what that might mean.
So one thing that EDHREC does very strangely is they have different places where data is held. So for example, they have, when you look up a card, you have, data. Or when you look up like Boros staples, they have a page for Boros staples. That will show different, numbers than when you just look up the card. Like, for example, when we found Esper Sentinel in Boros Staples, it said it was in, the 20% or 15% or something of 6,000 decks. And my guess for what that means is 6,000 decks is the number of white-containing decks that have been updated since that card came out, and that's what it's maybe trying to give you the data for, but there's nothing that says this, and it's just that's just a guess at best.
With how small that number was compared to the total amount of decks, I think that's the fairest guess.
Yeah.
But that's still just a guess, and if there is somebody who could tell us what exactly that means and why those numbers change, because outwardly, like we were talking about, if you look on like their main page, the numbers are consistent. You look at like an Azorius card compared to another Azorius card, and the amount of decks that their percentages out of are the same. Mm-hmm. But when you go onto a different page, things start to change a little bit. That percentage out of the amount of decks that it's drawing from is different.
And they never really tell you what the thing is that they are doing there. So I would, maybe if there was like a nice info box or something that you could click or something, and maybe there is, but I'm not aware of one, where it would give you more insight into how the data is being represented, that'd be nice. But even, I think we've been there, I don't remember exactly, but there's a couple other pages on their website where we see even different numbers. So it's not just like the two. There's been like at least 3 or 4 places where different numbers are represented, and we're not quite sure what they all mean. So I think that's a major flaw with the data. And it's not like it's wrong data. Like the data is presumably, correct, assuming that the data it collects from is correct, right? It's just that data is a very tricky thing, and interpreting it is really important. So if you just kind of give all the data to the players, you're kind of skipping that interpretation phase.
I think it is fair to assume that there is a reason for it being like that makes sense, and maybe if it is a reason more obvious than we're seeing and we're just being dumb, like I would like to know. But aside from that, it's either assume that there's a reason for it or go with my conspiracy theory that none of the decks on EDHREC are real. It's all fake, and it's just like
I feel like that's not the case.
Somebody's being punked. Well, that's very unlikely.
That would be crazy.
That would be crazy.
That'd be a ride.
It's just when we were like super analyzing it, I was like pulling at my hair and trying to figure out like what is going on here.
Yeah. So something else that people do with this misleading data is they will use this data as like the sole argument behind their argument. So people will say something along the lines of, oh, this card shows up in 600 decks, therefore card bad or card good, QED, that's all they have to say about it. And that's really not what I think is reasonable to use this data for. I think it's more for adding to a point, not making the point in itself, right? Mm-hmm. I think, Eli, we were listening to even the newest Command Zone episode, and Jimmy mentions the new dog that rampant growths you in white, and then he mentions the old one, the
easy comparison, Knight of the White Orchid.
But he just says this card is in 10% of white decks, and then kind of for no reason doesn't make any other points. He just says that.
Yeah, so he's like, Knight of the White Orchid is in about 20% of white decks, so therefore this backs up my statement that the new Loyal Warhound, or whatever it's called, is a new white staple.
And it's like, I mean, I guess, but what do we even consider a staple? Is 10%? I think it might have been like 11% of decks. I don't quite remember. But does that even count as a staple? Like, I don't think you've even made that argument or anything, but it's just very, and people on Twitter will do this all the time as well. They'll be like, this card that I play is in, 35 Sir Conrad decks or whatever. People don't know what they're talking about or whatever. And it's like, that's not like the entire argument. You should probably make another argument along with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of decks that get put on there, and, it's fair to say sometimes maybe, like, they kind of do this thing, we'll mention it probably later in the show about, like, the challenge the stats kind of thing on EDHREC cast. And sometimes, people might have some bad takes on what goes into a deck, or, like, what shouldn't go into a deck. And it's a conglomerate of data. The average
of a Kenrith deck isn't necessarily an argument for what should be put in a Kenrith deck. It can give you very good ideas. Like, I'm not going to say browsing EDHREC is bad. I do it even for making my decks. Like, you'll look and see what people play and decide, like, what you want to play, right? It's fine. But, like, don't use that as your sole argument for why a card should be played because it's in 60% of decks.
Yeah, EDHREC is good for seeing those kind of commanders that work really well with very specific kinds of cards. If you don't want to take the effort to like do a Scryfall or a Gatherer search for all those kinds of cards, and you just want to go and see what are other people doing, like what are some of the best like versions of those effects, then EDHREC is a good tool for that. But it's going to miss some things, obviously. Like there'll be things on there that people didn't see because it's just going off of somebody sees somebody's deck list or somebody's idea, and then they do the same thing, and then another person does the same thing.
And you have to be very careful as well, especially when you start to look at less popular commanders, or you start to do things like they have a section where you can kind of take only decks that exclude certain cards or include certain cards. You have to be careful when you start getting down to really low sample sizes, because they still give you the same percentage statistics. It just means less the lower sample size you go down.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point, bringing up lesser played commanders, because like I was saying, that with looking at deck lists online, it kind of creates, especially like with a commander that has many different versions of the deck, and maybe sometimes there's even commanders that they get kind of like little communities around them of like people who want to like make the deck better, or like see like what's viable and like what will make the deck better, and like what card they should take out or put in. And it kind of creates this little like feedback loop. But like with a deck that nobody wants to play, like Sequar the Swamp King or something, like you're not going to find anything.
If there's like 10 Sequar players and like they're all like closely knit, like all the decks, or at least half of the decks or something, are going to be those players, and they're going to really, really kind of give a false impression of what the average deck looks like, because they're all like kind of together.
I just think the fewer amount of decks there are for a certain commander,
valued, right?
the less you have to really pull from there, and you're not going to find much value.
Mm-hmm. Another thing about the misleading data we have here is this idea of how EDHREC kind of collects their deck lists, and not specifically like which sites it uses, but like there's a lot of pitfalls that can go into the deck lists that it collects. So if you weren't aware, I believe EDHREC only uses decks that have been updated in the last 2 years, so have had some change to it in the last 2 years, I believe.
I believe so.
But there's a lot of potential problems of like misrepresentation of decks. So for example, the first thing I want to talk about is a lot of decks that are in EDHREC are just collections of decks that people have built on some deck building website, and never even with the intention to buy or build or play. And they're not necessarily all... I mean, and do you really think that decks that no one has played or whatever should be held to the same standard or treated the same way as decks that people actually have? I feel like they shouldn't be, right?
Yeah, it's like how we might link to a quote from this in the editing, but there was a bit on the Commander Clash podcast where they were talking about the Hull Breacher ban, and how Hull Breacher was showing up in 20% of decks that could play it on EDHREC.
The only data that we can really use is anecdotal evidence, which is not great, and like EDHREC, which also has its own issues where like a lot of people will just make decks and not necessarily play them, and those get picked up by EDHREC as well. But that is the best. That is one of the best things we have right now. It's still 18%. So for just blue decks, for like the total all decks, I believe, which is a staggering amount.
But there's no way that's correct, though, right? Like a $25 card and 20% of blue decks of actual casual Magic players.
I don't think it is. I don't think it is true. I think a lot of people are just building random decks and they'll throw it in, but they don't intend to actually build it. But like again, like if we're ever citing EDHREC for anything, this is always going to be same like some bias there or error. But it's the best that we have. Like we don't have other entry points.
And the cast was kind of finding that suspicious, because you wouldn't assume that 1 in 5 commander players that play blue are playing Hull Breacher in their deck, because that's kind of it's one of the meanie no-no cards. I mean, when it was legal, that is, you know.
Yeah, and I think most players' experience playing commander would be that is not the case. Like that there's far less Hull Breachers than 1 out of 5 blue decks, right? Mm-hmm. So that makes you think that people are just putting Hull Breacher in their lists and then not actually playing the decks, or maybe just kind of brewing something up and never playing it or something. So I don't know. That's a bit. I mean, there's not really much that EDHREC can do to prevent collecting from those decks, but just it's a point to maybe consider that some of the data isn't perfect, right?
Yeah, I think it's a similar thing with some fast mana cards like Mana Crypt or Jewel Lotus, stuff like that. Cards that people might not actually have, but maybe they're making a deck list and they want to see, like, what's this deck look like if it's as optimal as it possibly can be.
Yeah.
But obviously, like, half of Commander players don't have a Jewel Lotus or whatever that percentage is on EDHREC.
Yeah, so for example here, not for example, that's not what I'm trying to say, but what I'm trying to say is that deck lists online aren't necessarily indicative of the decks that people actually play. So, people might have a deck list online and then they update a card in their deck and they don't, kind of obsessively update their deck list on their website, right? Mm-hmm. So that's also another inaccuracy from the data that I could, as a potential downfall, right? A potential pitfall of EDHREC data collection.
Yeah, or maybe I want to put my Magic Online deck lists onto a deck building website so I can goldfish hands or something like that.
And there's a bunch of not problems, but there's like inaccuracies and like things about that, because like on Magic Online, Mana Crypt is a $5 card and Soul Ring's a $10 card. So my Magic Online deck doesn't have a Soul Ring, but it has a Mana Crypt.
Alpha Beta duels are average $1
yeah.
on Magic Online.
It's just things to keep in mind when you're looking at the decks. And I think another important thing that we had, Eli, was that, sometimes people will do the thing where, like, they find a deck list online and they will, like, make a copy of it, to, like, put it in their, like, their page or whatever, right? And they, like, maybe make a couple changes or something like that. From what I understand, those decks are captured from EDHREC similarly to how any deck is, right? Like, let's say I find somebody's Glissa deck and I just copy it to my page and then I change a couple cards and I'm just like put it away for later. Maybe I'll build it later, right? That's still counted, right?
Yeah, there's this, along those lines, you'll notice how popular new commanders, specifically commanders from precons, rise to the top ranks of like popular commanders on EDHREC. Mm-hmm. And there's this kind of theory, I'm not sure if it's confirmed in any way, that a lot of people are just putting deck lists of straight out of the box, maybe one or two changes, precons onto deck building websites.
Yeah, like for example, you'd put up your Osgear deck, and then you'd do like maybe like some sort of like, oh, let me just take out some lands, put new lands in, maybe a couple cards, right? And even if like they don't have intentions to keep the precons together or whatever, right? Like they just put them up because it's what they got, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a reason why precons, I think, end up higher up on those websites. Maybe not even, maybe they're not actually that represented like in the wild, but that's just kind of like how they appear through the data, right?
Mm-hmm. And this is even something that gets brought up on the EDHREC cast every once in a while when they're challenging some stat or something like that. They'll look at a card that's being overplayed and be like, well, was that in a precon? Yeah, it was. So
yeah, and sometimes people will have, like, I've done this myself. If let's say I have my Kenrith deck or something, right? And let's say I have my Kenrith deck from 2020 and then my Kenrith deck from, January 2021, and then I save it again as Kenrith February 2021. And like I want to keep the deck list separate. From what I understand, as long as something has been updated in the last 2 years, it will still continue to take all those decks as different decks, even though they're all me updating one deck, right? If you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So if you like save 5 versions of a deck separately, it'll still count it as 5 decks. And that's just like we said, there's nothing you can really do about that, but it's just a thing to keep in mind, right? Mm-hmm. Do you have anything else to add to this topic, Eli, of the misrepresenting or misleading data?
Well, I just wanted to bring it back to this conversation we had a couple days ago when we were working on the notes for this about what level of enfranchisement are people at in playing Magic or playing Commander, where they put a lot of their decks or like every deck online, or where they make, like we were saying, those
changes very like often every time.
Yeah, like changes, or they even make like prototypes of decks and like first drafts or something for decks they might not even make in paper. Like what kind of people are doing that, and if if it is just in franchise players, what's the deal with the pre-con thing? It's
Yeah, it's a little bit confusing. Like the idea of a certain type of player that is likely to put all their decks online, wouldn't then in that case the data be kind of skewed towards those players and away from the kinds of players who don't put their lists online or don't update them all the time? And it's not like, I keep saying this, and I'm sorry for being a broken record, but it's not necessarily something that they can avoid very easily. It's just another thing to think about when you're using the data to make a point, or you're trying to, use the data to tell somebody why they should or shouldn't do something.
I'm just saying, it's maybe worth considering that like 80% of the decks that are being drawn from here is just Redditors or something. Nothing wrong with Redditors, but it's just people who are perpetually online, I'm thinking, is where you get a lot of... Because, we put our decks online, but I said, we don't update them that often, and it took me a long time to ever think about doing it. I just ended up putting my decks online mostly because I wanted a way to like Goldfish easier without having to shuffle up my deck.
And not all my decks are online. Like I most of mine are, and I even have decks that I have taken apart since now online, and those are counted as decks I have, right? Just whenever I make a new deck, though, I don't automatically put it online. So I don't know. There's a lot to be said about this idea, but if we can maybe move on a little bit, the main thing that I want you to get away from this is it's up to you, the user of EDHREC, to remember that it's not your job to think that everything is perfect and use the data however you want it.
Only you can prevent the spread of
cringe,
misinformation, and cringe on the internet.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, that's our final point. Just it's on all of us to remember that EDHREC, it's far from perfect. It's what you got. So nothing wrong with using it.
Mm-hmm.
But we just wanted to mention some little things to finish this out about EDHREC and like the EDHREC cast.
Yeah, bringing them up a little bit. They do a thing on their podcast called Challenge the Stats, where I think what's the tagline, Eli? It's do you remember what they say when they do it?
Gotta challenge some stats, y'all. There's a whole bunch of data here on EDHREC, but we don't always agree with it. Sometimes cards see too much play, sometimes they see too little play. So what we love to do here is challenge those stats.
But that's kind of, the fact that they even do that is kind of a self-admission that the data is flawed in some way, or it's not perfect, right? Mm-hmm. So that's even straight from the source, the people you would expect to be the most supportive of the data, because I'm not trying to allege some conspiracy or something, but there's a self-admission of some problem with the data, at least in certain cases, right? And there's a lot of, weird data on EDHREC as well that seems wrong, or it's misleading or something, and it's just kind of an anomaly of the way that it's working.
Oh yeah, one of those things was a notable challenge the stats. Fairly recently, it might have been a couple months ago,
yeah.
But Dana brings up that his challenge for the week is the card Farseek. And you think at first, well, Farseek, that's a good card. That makes sense that it'd be played in a lot of green decks. But then he's like, well, Farseek, I think, is overplayed in mono green decks. And you think, wait, who would ever put Farseek in a mono green deck?
For those that don't know, Farseek searches your library for a plains, swamp, island, or mountain. It cannot get a forest card unless it also has one of the other types. So in a mono green deck, it is not able to search for any land in your deck.
Yeah.
And Dana makes a big point about this because it shows up in like 40 green decks or something on the website, or whatever the number was, I don't quite remember, of mono green decks. And he's like, this is a card that's played too much. And my point to my rebuttal to him is, I don't believe you that card is actually played in green decks. I think that it's in people's lists that they either haven't played it in paper or haven't played it online once, or it's in lists where they're going to play it, they're going to play the card, someone's going to say, hey, bro, that doesn't work, and then it's immediately coming out.
So since we've been back playing at the game shop, I met somebody there who would say things every once in a while that seemed kind of questionable or suspect to me. and I would wonder, like, these things he's saying sound familiar, and then I finally put it together that he was must have been listening to the EDHREC cast and just saying things from their Challenge the Stats as if like he had seen them happen in person. And one thing he said to me was like talking about overplayed cards, and he was talking about Farseek, and like he was saying how he'd seen people play Farseek in their mono green deck, and I was like, wait, have you actually seen that happen? And he's like, he kind of like stopped for a moment and was almost like, yeah, I have, yeah. Like, it's like, no, you haven't.
I don't think you have. Or
you heard that? You heard Dana saying that, and you thought he was talking about real people playing real decks. But I feel like if you were building an actual paper commander deck, and you got to Farseek, you read Farseek, and you're like, oh wait, yeah.
Yeah, and I think some of those decks might just be like, someone's making their deck online, like on their website, and then they're like, okay, let me just put all the green ramp spells in here or whatever, right? Like, let me just throw them in, like I found them on a list, I just copy paste them or something. And
yeah,
they
you
just
copy
overlooked
paste,
it.
because
Yeah.
you're not looking at each individual thing, you're taking a list of cards and moving it from one section, like a different deck, to another one.
Yeah.
So you're not looking at the individual card. That's the only way I can see that happening.
Yeah, and just for clarity, this was on episode 149 of the EDHREC cast, talking about tribal deck fundamentals, if you're interested. Somewhere around 30 minutes in or something, I believe.
Yeah, so we just wanted to point that out as a big example of how it's easy for stuff like that to happen when you're building your deck online.
Yeah, and I've got another quick anecdote as well about that, and that's there's a section on EDHREC for themed decks, okay? And under these themes, they have a section for recent reprints. And I was looking through these themes and looking at the reprints, and I was looking at the equipment theme deck, or equipment theme, and if you scroll down to reprints, there are 3 reprints listed for the equipment theme, of which 99% of the commanders were Boros or Boros plus black, and there was like 1 blue deck. The 3 cards on the reprints for this were Counterspell, Talisman of Ingenuity, I believe, or Creativity, Talisman of Creativity,
Yeah, the Izzet one.
The Izzet one, and what's it called?
Bajuka Bog?
Bajuka Bog. These were the 3 reprints for the equipment theme. And all I could think of was, what is this data telling me? Like even if you were to scroll through all of their commanders they had up there, there was 1 commander that had blue in it of like the 30 commanders, and it was at the very bottom of the commander. So it's like, I get it, they just reprinted Counterspell, but this is not the kind of card that you want to...
Here are 3 generic staple cards that go in many decks of these colors.
And it's like, no, it just was like, here's 3 cards that got reprinted that are in like 3 decks that are under this theme. And it's like, why? Why are you doing this? So it's just, they have some anomalies sometimes, and just, they're pretty funny when you find them. I think on I had that as like a trivia question. I was like, what theme are these 3 cards the recent reprints for? And nobody got it because, of course, why would you?
It's a trick question.
Yeah. But Eli, yeah, I think we've been kind of bashing on EDHREC for a bit here, but we do want to kind of bring it back, right? A little bit.
I got one more.
Oh, you got one more?
I gotta say,
we got to bash a little more.
Depala being number 4 on EDHREC under Boros Commanders. That is a lie. That is not true. I refute that. I will not believe it. Maybe you could say Osgir got up to be number 2 in, like, what's it been? Just a couple months since he came out?
Yeah.
Maybe that's possible. Maybe he's just popular and good enough that even in that short amount of time it's surpassed every other cooler, better Boros commander. Maybe that's possible. But Depala? No. I don't buy it.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting piece of stats that it might even be correct, but it just seems so odd. Right?
I'm going to challenge that stat.
Going to challenge that stats. Yeah. Depala is not the 4th most popular Boros commander. That's fake news. No. Well, have you guys seen a Depala deck in the wild? I've only seen 1 Depala deck ever, and the guy doesn't have the deck anymore.
I've never seen it. I feel like I've played a lot of Commander. I've never seen her.
I've seen like 7 or 8 Osgir decks, 7 or 8 Feather decks.
I have to fight these weekly urges to build new Boros commanders, and I never feel the urge for Depala. So if that's I don't know. That's just my opinion.
We're just a little bit of haters right now, but
haters.
Don't take any of that personally. We're just kind of goofing on Depala,
Yeah.
Okay, but now we gotta talk some defense of EDHREC. So why don't you start us off, Eli? Say something good now that you said something bad.
Well, so one of the premises of this episode was the idea: is flawed information better than no information?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, Spencer?
So that's a really difficult question, right? Because there's a lot to it. I think Magic players in general really like to, they really like information. So they like to cling to whatever even flawed information they can get. So in that sense, maybe the bad information is doing harm because players will kind of instinctively use it to mean more than it does, right?
Yeah, I mean, humans are naturally curious. We want to know everything sometimes.
But that being said, obviously EDHREC is cool and it's a net positive, I think, right?
Yeah, I think it's good that it exists. I think that's kind of why we're doing this episode, is we just want to get that out there and make more people aware that you've really got to... You can't just look at it and take it at face value. You've got to think about it a little bit.
Oh, yeah. Just one thing that really triggers me is whenever I see those people that just use EDHREC numbers in decks, like this is in this many decks, as their sole argument for something. That's a big pet peeve of mine. Please just put some more thought into it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a thing you can bring up and a thing you can mention, but it's not like it's what's the thing?
QED.
QED, yeah.
Yeah. Which if you're unfamiliar, means you put that at the end of like a proof it's like, and thus it was shown, I think is the quote.
Yeah, what is it?
It's a Latin phrase. I don't think we have it written down.
I had it written down.
Quod erat demonstrandum.
Yeah, I like that.
Yes, there you go. I moved it on the show notes so you couldn't find it. One thing to say that's really nice about EDHREC is that, it's a really good tool, I think, for new players and even in franchise players making decks or looking for suggestions for their existing decks. Like, everyone will use EDHREC. Maybe not everyone, but it is the most popular site, and for a good reason. It's a good-looking site, too. It's well put together.
Yeah, we use it.
Yeah, I'll
admit to that.
Every bad thing we have to say, we use the site.
I don't really use it to build decks, but if I'm making a new deck, I maybe want to see what's a really popular card that might show up in there, and what's something I might not have thought of, because clearly we like to hear other people's opinions on stuff and see what other people are doing.
Yeah, EDHREC did kind of revolutionize deck building in some way, because before, to build decks, you would either have to pull from only your knowledge, do like a giant gatherer search for cards, or look at other people's decks as ideas. Now you have kind of a conglomerate of decks that you can kind of at least browse through the cards and think about them. Maybe not put value on the numbers in them, but you have a list of cards that might go in your deck, which is nice.
Yeah, I would say accessibility of information is almost always a good thing for expanding your player base and getting new people invested in your game.
And even one of the best things about EDHREC, I think, is just the ability to go to EDHREC.com and then click commanders, then click, Jund or whatever, and then just look at all the Jund commanders. It's a little bit easier than doing a gatherer search, than just to see all of the commanders you can play in those colors, to look for a new deck or something. It's a really good thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so do you want to kind of hit us with this last thing? I know, Eli, you had brought up is EDHREC data, is flawed information better than no information,
Well, let's
right?
imagine a world without EDHREC.
Yeah, let's imagine there is no EDHREC. What do we have?
What fills... It's like they say when you topple a dictator, there's a power vacuum. What fills the void?
What is it, Eli?
What would be the new great dictator of commander information?
So we were looking about online to scour the internet for sources of, commander statistics, right? And there really is only one other source that we could find. What is that source, Eli?
Our old nemesis, the command zone. Josh Lee Kwai.
He's sitting in a chair petting a cat.
So a couple of years ago, I think this first one was 2018, they did this big stat... It was a series. There was 2 episodes. They did a stats series where they brought in some professional statistician and
as a consultant or
as a consultant, and they looked through over 300 different gameplay videos, including episodes from Game Nights, MTG Mudsta, Star City Games, Commander Versus, and Commander Clash from MTG Goldfish.
Yep.
And they had certain things they were looking at when they did this to like see what's the most winningest color, or what's the
That was their quote, not our quote.
yeah
We don't say winningest.
winningest. Yeah, the what does turn 1 Soul Ring positively or negatively impact you? Stuff like that. And so they drew a lot of, some of their conclusions from that were for example, that turn 1 Soul Ring decreases your win percentage, going first increases your win percentage, winning players have more lands in play at the end of the game on average, and Super Friends was the winningest deck type.
Yeah, archetype or whatever.
And then in part 2 of their video, they just talked about the best and worst colors, and I think their color breakdown was black number 1, then green, then blue, then red, then white. And this is, I think we had a clip in one of our previous episodes where they say white decreases your win percentage overall, and DJ says, that's actionable data right there.
That's like saying that if you take white out of a deck that is white containing, it makes your deck better. And actionable data, what that means is it's data that you can take action upon. So he's saying you should do this. You should take white out of your deck because you get a higher win percentage if you play a Jund deck instead of a 4-color deck.
Yeah, and
it was very triggering for me.
Say what we will, and obviously this is gameplay statistics compared to like deck building statistics, so it's kind of a different
beast, right?
Different ballpark. But EDHREC, even without the tapped out, their sample size, maybe it is large enough for those percentages to mean something,
right? Yeah.
Over 300.
That's
that sample size.
That was their first sample size for Command Zone. Oh, they said over 300. So, by the way, quick cheat for everybody in the audience. If someone says over 300, they mean like 320. Okay. If someone ever tells you, I've got all these good reasons, I've got A and B and many more, they really just have A and B. They don't have many more. Otherwise, they would have said them. But 300 is not a good sample size whatsoever. I think, Eli, you were listening to their thing back, and you said they had talked to their statistical
their consultant. Yeah, they had I never really thought about this much because I listened to this episode when it came out and a couple times since then because I go back to it and like we gotta farm content,
Yeah.
So maybe we'll even do a deeper dive on these episodes some other time. But they had this bit talking to their consultant, and he pretty much was telling them it was a separate clip. It wasn't during the episode, so it was like a pre-recorded or recorded after the fact that they edited in. And he was talking to them about how this sample size, you couldn't really draw too much from it, and you shouldn't like make any very clear statements about anything because it's not for sure.
Yeah, and to be a little bit fair, they do at the start of the episode say something along the lines of, "This isn't like perfect data or whatever. We're going to use this to kind of back up our assumptions or maybe get us to ask more questions." They don't treat it as it is gospel or whatever, right? But that being said, I think, there's a lot of problems with it, and I think they go a little bit too far with what they say from it. That's what I think.
Yeah, they have that statement from the consultant, and then they preface it a little bit, and then the farther they go into doing it, the more they seem to kind of forget that.
Yeah,
they get a little bit lost in the sauce.
It feels like that, yeah. Yeah. And I think, Eli, what was it? Their second one they did? When was that? 2019, 2020?
I think 2019, they did Command Zone like game Commander Mythbusters or something like that.
And they looked at like 50 decks for this one.
Yeah, they looked at like 50 games around,
or 50
games,
there. Not decks, sorry.
Yeah. So a much, much smaller sample size. And then they started saying a bunch of other things about how long games go, how many times you cast your commander, how many times you attack.
Eli and I have this thing not every time we play a game, but every once in a while, you'll play a game of Commander, and then you'll be like, what's the average? What did the Command Zone say? The average times you cast your Commander per game? 1.5 per player? How many times was a Commander cast this game? Oh, like 15 times the whole game? Thinking emoji.
Yeah, and I don't think there's anything that wrong with them doing something like this and being like, hey, this is just some interesting things that we found. But some of the things they say with such confidence, like the actionable data thing, and they say it to such a wide audience that there's people like I was talking about the guy at the shop, like quoting the thing from EDHREC. People will hear this information and they'll take it almost like it's close to fact, because they'll be like, well, these guys did the data, like they don't understand what the sample size really means.
Yeah, and I know I've heard Jimmy or Josh, I can't remember who exactly, in the after they've made these episodes, reference them as data for their points. So for example, Jimmy might say something along the lines of, this 6-mana commander is bad because we only cast our commander on average one time a game. Or Josh might say something along the lines of, on average, we're only seeing that people have like 2.5 attack steps per game. So this card that has an attack trigger isn't going to get much value. And that's just like not like that's going against their whole point of the data not being able to be extrapolated like that. And then they're going in the future and using it, or at least hearkening back to that data, maybe not in a very honest way. That's what I think. And I don't think they're intentionally being dishonest. I think they're just kind of falling into the trap. I don't think the command zone is trying to mislead people.
Yeah, Josh mentions this thing in their first run of stats videos, how he liked that the consultant they brought on wasn't an enfranchised commander player. He played Magic, but not specifically commander, so he keeps saying, it's good that you don't have any biases for commander. You're not looking to prove anything.
Yeah.
But then after the fact,
they're looking to prove something.
Josh is definitely looking to prove some stuff.
Like, what was he talking about? He used the win percentage going first increase to kind of make his point for Vedalken.
Oh, yeah, so this is something, it's kind of tangential, but I wanted to bring it up because I was just re-listening to this, and it gets me how they talk about how the player going first has an increased win percentage, and that's something that I would have agreed with, and that I do agree with.
That seems reasonable.
I think first player does have an advantage. And the reasons they bring that up, or the points they bring up for the first player having an advantage, is that, so if you're the first player and you win the game, that turn you had the extra resources.
You had
on
the
that
extra
turn,
card, the extra mana, all those things.
Yeah,
right?
You're the first person to have access to a certain amount of resources, and I think that is a big deal. So if you win first, you pretty much had an extra turn up on the rest of the players.
If you win on turn 8, you had a turn 8, the other players didn't have a turn 8.
Yeah, and so the resource from that is the mana advantage from getting that extra untap and drawing the extra card.
And the attack step, I guess, as well.
Yeah. And so Josh starts turning it into this thing about how this is why Vedalken Ori is so good, because it lets you change your spot at the table. And DJ like immediately kind of like, bless him, he bites back a little bit, and he's like, wait, that's not really how that works, because you took your turn off to play Vedalken Ori, and you're not getting the extra amount of resources. And Josh just keeps, he won't concede that, that just, it's not true,
Yeah, it's a little bit of, obviously Vedalken Ori does give you advantages. Like, it allows you to play at instant speed. You can take a turn off and then play end step or whatever, right? But that's not like the point they were making about.
Yeah,
it doesn't fit.
I get the statement of saying Vedalken Ori lets you change your spot at the table. That being said, it does not leapfrog you in front of somebody.
You're still behind everybody.
It doesn't put you ahead of player one. That's just never the case.
You're still the fourth player or the third player at the table, and you still need to wait your turn. If you lose the game, on turn 9, the player going first wins on turn 9, you did not have your turn 9.
Yeah, you still untap and draw on the same turn count as you normally would. So I just wanted to bring that up. And oh, Josh.
Well, I think we've kind of cooled down a little bit. We've had our little bit of a rant. I just want to not preface, because I'm saying it after the fact. So, everybody, all loved everyone, EDHREC, Command Zone, all these people. They're all great people for the most part, and no hatred towards any of them. They're all doing their best. We just got a little complaints every once in a while.
Well, it's like we said. What's worse, no information or bad information? Magic players, I'm certain, would rather have the bad information or the flawed information than no information.
Almost certainly, yes.
And that makes sense. That's an appealing thing. People don't want to feel in the dark. People don't like not knowing stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We're curious. So I think it's net positive that these things have been done. Yeah,
and if you've got any experiences or cool takes about EDHREC, we'd love to hear them. I did some searching online, and I really couldn't find too many negative takes about EDHREC talking about some of the things that we're talking about today. So if you have any places that you've seen that happen, or you want to let me know, I would be interested to hear. I did see, just a slight aside, I did see some negative takes about the command zone stats, because there was certainly some problems with that, but mostly on Reddit and stuff like that. And Josh has said he does not go on Reddit. He's specifically said that very recently, within the last month. And God bless his soul.
Jimmy will, though.
Jimmy will.
If you want to get him.
Yeah, probably. I don't know. But I think that about does it for the main topic for this episode, right, Eli?
Yeah, I think that's it's about what we got to say. And yeah, like Spencer said, let us know if you have any other takes on anything, or if we're totally wrong on a bunch of stuff, or if there's something big that we missed or misunderstood. We really don't know. This is another kind of episode where we end it and we're like, we don't know.
This is one of the reasons that we took us so long to make this episode, because it's very hard to collect all this data about the data that is about EDHREC. It's hard to come in. We like to be pretty prepared for our episodes. I think generally we do a decent bit of research for every episode, and this was one where we were kind of scared to do it, because we're like, man, maybe we haven't done enough research for this before to do the episode. And I think at the end of the day, though, it's probably just okay to get out and do it. I think we did do a good job preparing for it, but it's a little bit intimidating. And that kind of brings me along to what is at least part of our little ending segment that I want to talk about, which is kind of encouraging other people who are maybe not really, or maybe want to do something like a podcast or other content or write articles or whatever, and are a bit scared to do it. Maybe we can talk about our experience with starting the podcast all the way back in November, I think, of last year. That was our first episode came out in January, but that was when we kind of started.
We did a little pilot.
We did a pilot episode, which is never to see the light of day because it was bad. But no, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about the origins of the podcast, Eli?
Yeah, so like Spencer said, we going on it must have been the end of 2020 or like
I think it was
summer.
November or September or something like that.
Well, before we recorded the pilot, we would kind of talk before going to play cards or like hang out or something, and we would talk about maybe starting a podcast sometime. It's something that I'd wanted to do for a long time, because I've been a long time listener and fan of like different Commander podcasts. I love podcasts. I love listening to all different kinds of topics on stuff, and I always thought that would be a fun thing to do. So I wanted to kind of refute some opinions, because a lot of the Commander podcasts and the shows you'll listen to, it was a lot of people saying the same thing over and over, and a lot of stuff that I disagreed with, and I didn't think it was very productive just to always be like, man, Spencer, these guys are being so cringe right now. Like, maybe we should, take some action on it and like do something about it.
Yeah.
Even if this doesn't have any real impact.
No greater impact on the format, right? But
yeah, I wanted to share some different views and hopefully put this out and encourage other people to share different views and
And I'm not trying to say that we've like made it, but we're coming up on 50 subscribers now. It's a big milestone for us. We started back in January, I believe January 1st, and now it's almost the end of July. So not the worst growth in the world. I'm pretty happy.
Yeah, I mean it's not 50,
like,
50 might seem pretty insignificant, but it's we put a decent amount of effort into it, but we really only do like the 2 podcast episodes and like maybe a tier list here and there and some other content. So we don't invest like a ton of time into it and like a lot of resources. And it's just been a really fun thing, and it's been really laid back, and I certainly appreciate all the effort that you've put into it, Spencer, because you do, I'd say more work than I do.
Yeah, just mostly the editing and stuff. But I do want to like just encourage other people, if you feel like there's something about Commander or Magic or anything in general that you feel like is not being represented well, try to get your word out there if you're the kind of person that wants to speak your mind, right? I think for me, especially in the past, I've been a person who's been really, really suffered from like a lot of, like social anxiety and stuff like that. So I would be very hesitant to start things. And I think one thing that really can help you if you're looking to try to start something is find another person who's willing to kind of get you to do it. So like, for example, Eli and I kind of push each other to keep getting the episodes out there, keep working on it. Otherwise, this probably wouldn't happen. If it was just a solo thing, it's really hard to get yourself to do something on your own.
Oh my god, if it was just me, we wouldn't get anything done.
Yeah, or same for just me as well. So, but yeah, so we're and I am happy, whenever I get a comment or whatever on the podcast, or there's a new subscriber or something. Even something small like that does bring you and I believe, Eli, a lot of joy. We're not doing it for viewers or whatever, but that does feel nice.
Oh yeah, and 50, it really does mean a lot to me, and I appreciate everyone who's listened and subscribed or left a comment or anything. That means a lot too. One way I've had it compared, and it's different for I heard this analogy for Twitch streamers, thinking you might think if you only have one or 5 viewers, that's not a big deal, but that's like a bunch of people coming over to your place, watch you do a speech or something. If you have 20 people, that's like you filled a classroom. If you have 100 people, that's like you filled an amphitheater.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to think about it. It really can kind of put you into, because it can be easy to kind of overlook that number and not really realize how many people that is, right? Mm-hmm. And then also thank you to everybody on Spotify or any other of the RSS feed podcasting apps. We do appreciate you guys as well. It's a little bit harder to gauge how many people are listening, but I think we have somewhere around 30 people that listen to all the podcast episodes. That's really awesome. Love all you guys too. Mm-hmm. And one more thanks I want to give. You were talking about Twitch streamers. You might have noticed there's a slight difference in audio quality this episode. We're rocking 2 microphones right now. My good friend Quinn, he's a Magic player as well. Also, he has a Twitch handle, SoullessMidWest. He got a new really good mic, and he gave us his old microphone here. Pretty nice one, too, to work on the podcast for. So thank you very much, Quinn.
Yeah, so in a way, this episode is sponsored by SoullessMidWest.
Follow him on Twitch and Twitter and stuff, and YouTube
absolutely.
if you want.
Yeah, he's an awesome guy.
Plays shooters and stuff like Escape from Tarkov.
We're hoping to have him on sometime.
Yeah, he's a really cool guy. Maybe have him on a tier list or an episode sometime. Mm-hmm. Yeah, do you have anything else that you want to kind of wrap up with, Eli, or is that pretty much what we got?
I think that's pretty much it. Just a final thank you to everyone for listening, and hopefully we'll probably see 50 subscribers within this week, I would think. And I don't know about doing a giveaway or something. I don't know how that would work. Maybe we can figure something out, way to say thank you, on Twitter or something.
Yeah, maybe it's just something fun.
We could make SoullessMidWest dance or something and post a video of that. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe just something, I don't know. We'll work on it. But that's about it. Yeah, I guess subscribe, Twitter, all that stuff, I guess.
Yeah, we're on Twitter at EDHTakes. Again, we don't really tweet much.
But you'll get the episode, and every once in a while, Eli or myself will give a little introspective meme or something.
But if you tweet at us or leave a comment on the episodes, we are very likely to respond. I check that
certainly
constantly. That's my other social media thing now is YouTube Studio.
Yeah,
just looking at that and seeing what people have to say. Because if somebody says something nice to me, I want to say thank you right away. Because we really do appreciate it.
All right, well, that's about all we got. So appreciate it, guys, and that's it.
Yeah, we'll see you next time.